Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. I would like to welcome you to today's session called Be Prepared Disaster Recovery with Therefore, where we'll be talking about disaster recovery, what it means for your business, how you can protect yourself, and how Therefore can help. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Kono, and I'm part of the digital engagement team here at Therefore. I'm also joined by my colleague Amber, who will be co-hosting today's session with me. Amber?
Awesome. Hi, guys. My name is Amber. I'm really excited to be talking about this webinar with you today. So let's get into it.
Great. So just before we get started, the usual housekeeping stuff with these webinars, please use the Q&A to ask us any questions you may have. It should be at the bottom of your screen within the Zoom interface. So before we get started, let's just go over the main points of today's agenda. First, we're going to look at disasters and disaster recovery in general and learn why this is important for businesses and organizations. Then we're going to look at some of the planning theory that goes into preparing for disasters, contingency plans, and the like. We'll also concretely look at some strategies for implementing plans like this. And of course, since we're here to talk about how Therefore helps, we have a whole section dedicated to planning your disaster recovery scenarios with Therefore. And finally, we have an interesting customer story for you where the customer really was struck by a natural disaster and their Therefore system ended up being their saving grace. More on that later though. For now, let's get started with disaster recovery. Before we can talk about recovery necessarily, I think it's important that we first establish how we define a disaster in the first place. In our research, we came across a definition which, in our opinion, is very suitable to define a disaster. Essentially, it is a sudden or great misfortune, or if we want to put it another way, any type of unfortunate or unwanted event. More precisely, a disaster is an event whose timing is unexpected and whose consequences are seriously destructive. In general, events that would be categorized as disasters due to their characteristics of misfortune generally include three elements. These are suddenness, unexpectedness, and significant adverse consequences for either a specific group or the general population. In addition to that, another undeniable element of what constitutes a disaster is a lack of foresight or planning. This could either be by accident due to a truly unexpected scenario, or perhaps also on purpose, essentially through inaction of parties who were responsible or would have been responsible for preparing contingency plans. So now that we know what a disaster is, we can start looking at the other side of the equation, which in this case is the recovery part. And according to Gartner, at least in the context of the IT realm, there are two basic elements to disaster recovery. First, the methods and procedures for returning a data center to full operation after catastrophic interruption. And secondly, the use of alternative network circuits to reestablish communication channels in case the primary channels are disconnected or not working. And we've put together this graphic here to show that disaster recovery is not a linear process, but rather a flow whose goal is to close the circle. We can see that once a disaster strikes and operations are disrupted, the goal of a DR plan is not only to restore vital operations, but also reconstitute them and improve them. And a step that's often forgotten is also the analysis of the disaster and an evaluation of the plan once the disaster has been cleared. This is something that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So the thing with disaster recovery planning is that it really is a huge amount of work. So people often ask themselves, how necessary is this? Is this an overabundance of caution? Aren't the risks of something happening really small anyway? Well, that is a very common and understandable line of thought, but the truth of the matter is that the risk is actually much higher than we think. So we have some stats here that we want to take a look at. According to research, the top causes of data loss are hardware failure, human error, software failure, and theft. And besides that, I think the information shown in this table is also very revealing in another way, because this table compares how often people perceive a disaster to happen and how often it actually happens in reality. So it's very interesting to see that people significantly overestimate how often hardware failures occur, and yet underestimate how often humans themselves are responsible for failures. What we can see from this is that while it is important to focus on the top culprit, in this case hardware and system failure, it's essential that human action or inaction really is taken into account in any solid recovery plan. So you may still be wondering if it's worth it to invest the time and energy into a disaster recovery scheme. Well, there are unfortunately some sobering statistics to back up why you really need to do this. According to the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, 93% of companies that lost their data center for 10 days or more due to a disaster filed for bankruptcy within 1 year of the disaster. In the same context, 94% of companies suffering from catastrophic data loss do not recover at all. So we can see that these stats back each other up. Other research from the likes of PricewaterhouseCoopers corroborates this data, as you can see that 7 out of 10 small firms that experience a major disaster go out of business within 1 year. So we can see here that we're not just talking about penalties or temporary setbacks. This is very serious stuff because, as the stats show, a disaster that results in a catastrophic data loss is, to be honest, statistically a death sentence for a business. We personally think it's much easier to just be prepared by having a sound disaster recovery strategy in place. So to conclude, we established that the risks posed by disasters in the context of catastrophic data loss are just simply too high to ignore. However, we are not here today just to ramble on doom and gloom about how terrible everything is. We're here to offer solutions to help you protect your organization against risks like these. So on that note, I'm going to pass it back to Amber, who is going to continue by telling us more about the theory behind planning and implementing disaster recovery strategies.
Yes. Thank you, Kono. As part of this section on theory of planning for a disaster, we first need to go over some basic concepts and clarify some areas where there could be some misunderstandings. There are a lot of buzzwords floating around in regards to this topic, so we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. The first thing we need to understand is the difference between disaster recovery plan and a security recovery plan. These may sound similar, but there are definitely differences between them, and we're going to highlight those. The first difference is the objective of each type of plan. Both plans focus on what must be done after disaster, but a disaster recovery plan is focused on general business continuity after disruption, while a security plan focuses specifically on information asset protection after a data breach has occurred. The type of response required by each type of planning also differs. A disaster recovery plan includes plans for external communications, for example, to customers and shareholders, while a security plan is much more inward-facing with the main goal of carefully analyzing the root cause of the issue and collecting evidence. The general focus of these two plans differs as well. A DR plan is mostly concerned with recovering operations and processes as soon as possible, while a security recovery plan places a larger emphasis on long-term recovery, improvement, and future loss prevention. And finally, when we talk about the dynamics of each plan, security planning differs a bit because cybersecurity threats are evolving literally day to day and can be very unpredictable. And for this reason, the plan needs to be really actively managed with the latest knowledge. A disaster recovery plan, on the other hand, is a little bit more static because the scenarios it prepares for example, natural disasters, what comes to mind, those things tend to have a more predictable outcomes and consequences. So, however, it is essential that both of these strategies be frequently revisited and updated, so neither one of them is truly static. And while this may sound complicated, it really comes down to following some basic core concepts. So before we go into more detail about creating the framework of an effective disaster recovery scheme, we need to keep the following key concepts in mind. The first is that a good DR plan needs to be documented, managed, and tested. You may get a bunch of smart people in the room, come up with an awesome plan for dealing with an emergency, but if you don't document it extensively, if you don't write it down, or keep it up to date with the changing developments as time goes by, it's really not going to be much help when you need it. So the second key concept is to develop a well-understood and aligned methodology for governance, communication, and escalation of your disaster recovery plans. A small organization may only need a single master plan to get through a disaster, but as that small company grows into a medium-sized company or even a large-sized company, the risks increase dramatically. So it's really important that a plan can be adapted, managed, and communicated in a consistent manner. By keeping these core tenets in mind, you're laying the foundation for an effective strategy that's going to minimize confusion and decrease recovery time when that disaster strikes. Okay, so now that we understand the overarching concepts on recovery planning, we can start getting into the nitty-gritty detail. While we've established the differences between disaster recovery and security recovery plans, we need to mention another aspect, often referred to as business continuity planning. This is very closely associated with disaster recovery planning, and the two can be thought of as both sides of a coin, intertwined, but with different focuses. Disaster recovery planning is the process or the actions by which you resume business after a major disruptive event has occurred. It's really focused on sort of rolling up your sleeves and doing everything possible to restore normal operations. On the other hand, business continuity planning is more theoretical. It's focusing on how business will continue to function even after smaller disruptions. So again, it's important to understand that these two planning concepts depend on each other heavily. Disaster recovery planning relies on business continuity planning to understand which actions should occur at what time, while business continuity planning relies on disaster recovery planning for those concrete actions that should fulfill whatever requirements the organization is facing. So let's take a closer look at the types of questions each of these plans should be addressing. Disaster recovery plans should be very factual and realistic, focus on which type of disasters could happen, and the potential effects on systems and people within the organization. They should also address which actions are required to return to normal operations and how exactly the situation is communicated externally, for example, to shareholders, the media, or authorities. Business continuity plans focus more on subjective topics, such as which information and systems are the most vital to continue business. And I say subjective here because these are generally topics people could have differing opinions about. For example, some people in the organization may say that it's more important to restart the production line as soon as possible, while others might argue that reestablishing the facility's telecommunications network is the highest priority. So business continuity plans should also answer questions about communication structures and who needs to access them in case of an emergency. Now, we all know the importance of disaster recovery, but what about the higher-ups who need to approve disaster recovery planning? Well, as I already mentioned, people, even within the same organization, have differing opinions and priorities. This rings especially true for the higher-ups. So we know how it can be a big challenge to get management to kind of buy into these processes you know are so important. So how can you convince management to invest in disaster recovery planning? As always, it's important to focus on what's important to management, what's important to the person, to your audience. In almost all cases, for management, their focus is going to be on the bottom line. So in that case, you want to first build your case by analyzing the financial side of the equation by estimating potential financial losses in case a disaster should occur. Then highlight the current organizational gaps that would either cause an issue with or completely impede recovery from a disaster situation. Finally, provide evidence of how risk management and recovery plans can address those gaps and bring it back full circle by showing how this will stem from financial losses. So we've talked a lot about the different ideas and concepts that should go into effective disaster recovery planning. Again, it may seem a little bit overwhelming since there were so many things to keep in mind, but our goal here is to get you started on the right path. To summarize what we've reviewed so far, let's briefly review the essential elements of a disaster recovery plan. First, conducting a business impact analysis helps establish priorities, identifies and evaluates potential effects of natural and man-made events. Next, an analysis of potential threats should serve to spell out a recovery plan for each scenario of the complete spectrum of potential interrupters to your business. You also need to make sure you focus on people. Identify the critical people charged with responding to a crisis and appoint a disaster recovery functional team and establish relationships with authorities before a disaster strikes. This is crucial in dealing with what is probably the most unpredictable element in situations like this. That is the people. You also need to make sure that you're doing regular practice drills to test plans and practice procedures. Finally, as always update your plan after changes are made to internal systems. You shouldn't neglect to make use of new technology or offerings to make your plan more efficient, resilient, and faster to implement. Okay, so that wraps it up for this part of the section. We've reviewed a lot of concepts that go into good disaster recovery planning, but we also know that there are tools out there that make planning easier to give you more peace of mind, especially when it comes to your IT systems. Therefore, it's a great example of a tool that you can use as part of your disaster recovery strategy as a whole. Based on the broad scope and nature of disaster planning, it's important to recognize that good preparation goes beyond software. Therefore, it might be able to save the files in your building, but it's not going to stop the tornado from reaching it. A correctly configured, maintained, and administered Therefore system helps you plan and prevent information loss in case of an emergency scenario. To hear more technical details about how exactly Therefore does this, I'm going to pass it back to Kono.
All right. Thank you, Amber. So as much as I would like it to, as you mentioned, Therefore is not going to stop a tornado from rolling through your building. So, but it can certainly help you recover once that disaster has occurred. So let's start off with this next part where I'm going into the details about disaster recovery with Therefore. I'm going to start off by referring back to the statistics we looked at earlier. And, despite the discrepancy between the perceived and the actual occurrence of each type of disasters, we do have to see that the hardware or system failures are still the most common cause of data loss. So that means that if you want to make sure your information is safe, you need to have a system to manage it. This means that a properly backed up information management system is an essential component of an effective disaster recovery plan. So in that case, let's get right to it and see how Therefore can help with disaster recovery. So it should be no surprise to anyone that our first suggestion for disaster recovery is to consider Therefore Online. The peace of mind that comes with having your critical business information offsite and backed up in the cloud is just invaluable. It's like having a huge umbrella over your organization. Even compared to just a few years ago, cloud solutions have become much more mainstream for businesses of all sizes, even from the smallest mom and pop shops all the way to world-spanning enterprises. So, I mean, this has been a steadily increasing trend over the past 10, 15 years or so, but I think we all know that the pandemic added fuel to the fire and made it clear how much cloud solutions can be a lifesaver in times of difficulty. Therefore Online runs on the Microsoft Azure platform, which is the leading cloud infrastructure provider. This allows us to offer the service globally in many different data centers in different geographies. These data centers are also geo-redundant, which means that each one is paired with another physical data center in the same geography, but just in a different location. This means that if a natural disaster should affect one data center, the paired backup data center is far enough away that the risk is massively reduced, if not eliminated altogether. The system is scalable to meet performance needs, complies to many global standards, and is highly secure. So besides the built-in innate security that comes with Therefore in general, Azure offers additional layers of encryption both at the file system level and while data is in transit. So in short, Therefore Online is probably the best option. It does provide the best protection and backup possible in case of disasters, and should really be the preferred option for technical implementations that require high resiliency. However, we do understand that cloud solutions are not for everyone. There are still many, many businesses and organizations that choose to run their applications on site using Therefore on-premise solutions. And this is where good disaster recovery planning from an IT point of view really becomes essential, since on-premise installations are the responsibility of the party running them alone. Fortunately, there is a lot you can do with Therefore to help you not only plan, but recover after disaster strikes. So again, to be clear, for the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about Therefores on-premise solutions specifically. I'm going to cover this topic by going into detail on 3 key concepts that make up the method for how Therefore plays an important role in a disaster recovery strategy. First, I'll explain the storage concepts to see how documents are archived in Therefore and what security measures are available to safeguard them. Then we'll take a look at automatic and manual backup options offered by Therefore to keep data safe in the event of a disaster. And finally, I'll go into more detail about the Therefore failover concept, which ensures high availability even in the case of partial system failure. All right, let's start off by looking at the Therefore storage concept. So, documents in Therefore, when you store something in Therefore, it's made up really of 2 components. The actual files themselves, these could be your PDFs, docx, XLSX, whatever files, which are packaged within Therefore in a secure proprietary format, plus the index data, which is used to classify and later find them in the system. The document itself is saved to what we call a category in Therefore, which is a dedicated space for related documents. And for example, you can have categories for things like invoices, statements, employee files, reports, whatever type of document you may have. At the same time, the metadata of the document, which as I mentioned we call index data within Therefore, is saved to the database, and a link is maintained between the 2. Documents that are saved to Therefore categories are then migrated to primary and backup storage, which I'll explain more in depth on the next slide. On the other hand, index data stored in the database can be easily backed up using standard database backup utilities, which really any competent system administrator should know how to do and should be doing. So we've now understood how documents are actually stored in the Therefore system. Now let's see how they're backed up. This is really the part where we see how Therefore helps in case of a disaster scenario. So as I mentioned, there is more than one component we need to talk about. The first one I want to talk about is how documents are backed up. Primary and backup storage is a standard feature offered in every Therefore system regardless of version. The storage locations are selected when the system is configured for the first time. Of course, they can be changed later on as well. And we do highly recommend that the backup storage be in a different physical location than the primary storage. This could be a disk in another part of the building, a different building completely, or even in another part of the world, really depending on your level of risk and risk mitigation. All that's needed is internet connectivity for the Therefore server to connect to it. The Therefore system automatically replicates the data to both primary and backup storage without any user intervention at all. This data transfer is determined by a completely configurable migration schedule, so the system admin has the power to determine the delta, or the amount of risk they're willing to tolerate in case of a disaster. For example, they may say that documents should be migrated every single day at midnight, so the most they can lose in case the system is inoperable would be 1 day's worth of information. This can also be made more frequent. You could decide that your acceptable risk level is 6 hours. Whichever way you choose, it can be configured within Therefore. These options are useful, first of all, because they're completely automated after the initial setup, and you have peace of mind knowing that your data is backed up in a secure location. So even if something catastrophic happens, the documents are still safe and the system can be recovered. Of course, the other part of it is the index data that belongs to the documents. This metadata is stored in the database and should be backed up regularly as part of normal IT best practices. The standard backup utilities provided by database manufacturers like Microsoft for SQL can be used to make backup copies of the Therefore database, and in case of a disaster, you restore it to recreate your Therefore system with either no or only minimal data loss. And finally, Therefore does also offer tools for manual backup and recovery options. As I mentioned, even in the case that the Therefore server is destroyed or inoperable, it's very easy to get up and running again. So if you've stuck to your disaster recovery plan, backed up your documents and databases, it's pretty easy to just fire up some new hardware, reinstall Therefore, and be up and running within very little time. Depending on your license type, you may need the Therefore team, the support team, to reset it for your new hardware, but this generally happens very quickly. Anyway, there's also some utilities like export utility or the document recovery utility that you can use in emergency scenarios where data is only partially backed up. Therefore, as a product, is focused on keeping your information safe, even in a worst case scenario. So we offer the tools and expertise you need to make sure that you can recover and get back to business as quickly as possible. The final concept I wanted to go over was the failover concept in therefore. So to give a bit of context maybe to those who are less technically inclined, with this concept we're talking about the ability to set up a highly available system that's meant to continue operating in the event of a disaster. So while the storage and backup features of therefore ensure that you can recover and get going after the fact, the failover features are actually meant to keep you going without any interruption to your business. So this works within Therefore because Therefore technology is based on and is compatible with many Microsoft technologies, including high availability clustering. The main objective of a clustered system is to provide protection and fallback in case a resource, in this case a Therefore server, goes offline. And a cluster is made up of two nodes, in this case Therefore servers, that are basically joined together within a private network. The system is set up in such a way that it can listen for both nodes and knows how to distribute the load between them. So in the case that, for example, there's a fire in the server room and one node is destroyed, the system recognizes the failure of that node and automatically fails over to the other. Users don't experience any interruption to the system because the resource redundance provides everything needed for the system to continue operating normally. In general, the nodes would be in separate locations to avoid the risk that we mentioned, such as physical destruction or inability to physically access the first resource for any reason. So now we've seen different types of tools and options that therefore offers you, so you can leverage the software as part of an effective disaster recovery strategy. For the final part of today's session, I'm going to hand it back to Amber at this point, who's going to tell us about that customer story that we mentioned earlier.
All right, now it is time for the customer story. So to give you guys a rough idea, here are the details. The customer is named GE Austria. They're located in Salzburg in central Austria, and they operate as a warehouse for spare parts for domestic goods such as home appliances. This is things like ovens, dishwashers, refrigerators, and so on. What happened in this case is that a torrential downpour caused a river near the warehouse to swell and create a massive flood. As this area is not typically known for having such types of natural disasters, no one expected anything like this to happen, at least at this magnitude. Unfortunately for GEV, their warehouse was close enough to the river to suffer heavily from this unfortunate event. So what was the extent of the damage? Well, since the river had flooded heavily, at its highest point, the office was completely covered in about 90 centimeters or 3 feet of water. As you can imagine, this created some massive damage. Everything in the basement and the ground floor, which was not brought to safety, including a slew of Canon multifunctional printers, unfortunately were completely destroyed by the water. Furthermore, €500,000 worth of inventory was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. So how did GEV manage to recover? Well, because they were prepared and kept a cool head, they were able to remove the Therefore server from the premises and bring it to a safe location shortly before the warehouse flooded. Once the floodwaters had retreated and the building was pumped out, the system was rebooted with no issues. GEV was able to get back to business very quickly. Just 3 days after the disaster, they were able to once again fulfill their usual number of daily orders, leaving their suppliers and customers astounded at the speed of their recovery. So thanks to the fact that they were saving all documents digitally and therefore they suffered no damage that would have happened if their files were physical and they hadn't been able to, remove a filing cabinet's worth of material out in time. So everything was digital, so it was safe. Even all the pending orders they had were saved in Therefore and thus recovered, meaning that at the end they didn't lose any sales at all. Since they trusted in Therefore, their data was preserved and no business critical information was lost. The general manager of GEV Austria, Mr. Friedrich Staller, had this to say about the incident. Quote, "Even though it hurt to lose our inventory, the goods can be replaced. Thanks to our electronic archive, we didn't lose a single business document and therefore we didn't lose a single order. By saving our document management system, we also saved our company." End quote. We're very happy to hear that GEV Austria was able to prepare for this possibility by investing in an information management system like Therefore, which did wonders in making a terrible situation much more tolerable. Thank you guys so much for joining us on this webinar. You can learn more by visiting us at our website at www.therefore.net. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Therefore TV, subscribe to our mailing list at therefore.net/newsletter, check out our blog on the website. Therefore.net/webinars has our upcoming webinars. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn, where we have new posts every 2 to 3 days. You can also contact us at therefore.net/contact or media@therefore.net. Did I miss anything, Kono?
Nope, I think we're good. Thank you very much, Amber, for co-hosting, and thank you everyone who joined. We hope you found the session informative and useful, and have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.